House of Mirth by Edith Wharton, chapters 4 and 5 today. I'm Catherine. Last time I read chapters 2 and 3. Just a couple of things before we begin. In the last chapter, Lily Bart was sitting on the train on her way to Belmont, and she was cutting a novel. Well, what that means is that in the past, when the books were bound, each picture was folded in half or folded together. So one long page folded like that, but the writing was on the inside of that fold. So you had to cut it open with a paper knife. And that gave the pages that allowed you to be able to read what was inside. And somebody wrote, it was kind of clever. I looked it up, and somebody wrote, every page is a tiny gift from the writer. So that's a nice way of putting it. But it was a bit of a task. Before you read your novel, you had to be chopping up your book. And it made sort of an edge, like a sort of a rough edge book. I think it's called Deckled or something. And even my Edith Wharton, this is 3 novels, even my Edith Wharton book has those pages, and I kind of like it. There's some texture that I like. I find that nice. Another thing is Americana. Mr. Percy Gryce really valued his collection. And when I looked that up, it's sort of a vague idea, a thing. It's like American, but it's kind of collectible things, perhaps manuscripts, certainly books, maybe first editions or originals of whatever. For example, I read there's about someone named Hubert Howe Bancroft, who lived from 1832 to 1918, was a real collector of Americana. He had a collection of 65,000 books of Western Americana and 100,000 manuscripts. So maybe originals, I don't know. So he would have been, this gentleman must have been an avid collector. Apparently he sold the whole of it to the University of California, Berkeley. So if you want to go see his collection, maybe it's still there. One other thing I found interesting is Mrs. George Dorset, the one that got on the train towards the end of chapter 2 and insisted upon sitting beside her friends, Percy and Lily. She had said that she had arrived earlier in her motor car. Well, the book was published in 1905, and when I checked, the Model T Ford hadn't even been invented. It came out, I guess, in 1908, the very first rendition of that. So having a motor car way back when that was written would have meant pretty high status in society, a nice rich family, or a rich couple anyway. Last thing, as far as chapter summaries go, I write the chapter summaries, so go ahead and read it in the show notes if you want to. I'll just say very briefly, Lily has decided to take the train and go to Belmont to visit her friends, the Trenors, I believe, who are hosting a party. Ends up that the party is just kind of a long, drawn-out get-together where they play a lot of bridge and gamble and have just great fun throwing money down on the table, winning, losing. They don't care. They all have so much money. Lily Bart doesn't do very well. She tried to resist playing bridge, but it just isn't the thing. You have to be part of the group if you want to belong. So you have to play, and you don't want to be seen as being chintzy. So you have to put down lots of money. And she ended up losing $300. Turns out that was pretty much her last $300. Chapter 4. The next morning, in her breakfast tray, Miss Bart found a note from her hostess. Dearest Lily, it ran, if it is not too much of a bore to be down by 10, will you come to my sitting room and help me with some tiresome things? Lily tossed aside the note and subsided on her pillows with a sigh. It was a bore to be down by 10, an hour regarded at Belmont as vaguely synchronous with sunrise, and she knew too well the nature of tiresome things in question. Miss Pragg, the secretary, had been called away, and there would be notes and dinner cards to write, lost addresses to hunt up, and other social drudgery to perform. It was understood that Miss Bart should fill the gap in such emergencies, and she usually recognized the obligation without a murmur. Today, however, it renewed the sense of servitude which the previous night's review of her checkbook had produced. Everything in her surroundings ministered to feeling of ease and amenity. The window stood open to the sparkling freshness of the September morning, and between the yellow boughs She caught a perspective of hedges and parterres leading by degrees of lessening formality to the free undulations of the park. Her maid had kindled a little fire on the hearth, and it contended cheerfully with the sunlight which slanted across the moss-green carpet and caressed the curved sides of an old marquetry desk. Near the bed stood a table holding her breakfast tray, with its harmonious porcelain and silver, a handful of violets in a slender glass, and the morning paper folded beneath her letters. There was nothing new to Lily in these tokens of studied luxury, but though they formed a part of her atmosphere, she never lost her sensitiveness to their charm. Mere display left her with a sense of superior distinction, but she felt an affinity to all the subtler manifestations of wealth. Mrs. Trenor's summons, however, did suddenly recalled her state of dependence, and she rose and dressed in a mood of irritability that she was usually too prudent to indulge. She knew that such emotions, leaving lines on the face as well as in the character, and she had meant to take warning by the little creases which her midnight survey had revealed. The matter-of-course tone of Mrs. Trenor's greeting deepened her irritation. If one did drag oneself out of bed at such an hour and come down fresh and radiant to the monotony of note-writing, some special recognition of the sacrifice seemed fitting. But Mrs. Trenor's tone showed no consciousness of the fact. "Oh, Lily, that's nice of you." She merely sighed across the chaos of letters, bills, and other domestic documents, which gave an incongruously commercial touch to the slender elegance of her writing table. "There are such lots of horrors this morning," she added, clearing a space in the center of the confusion and rising to yield her seat to Miss Bart. Mrs. Trenor was a tall, fair woman whose height just saved her from redundancy. Her rosy blondness had survived some 40 years of futile activity without showing much trace of ill usage except in a diminished play of feature. It was difficult to define her beyond saying that she seemed to exist only as a hostess, not so much from any exaggerated instinct of hospitality as because she could not sustain life except in a crowd. The collective nature of her interests exempted her from the ordinary rivalries of her sex, and she knew no more personal emotion than that of hatred for the woman who presumed to give bigger dinners or have more amusing house parties than herself, as her social talents, backed by Mr. Trenor's bank account, almost always assured her ultimate triumph in such competitions. Success had developed in her an unscrupulous good nature toward the rest of her sex, and in Miss Bart's utilitarian classification of her friends, Mrs. Trenor ranked as a woman who was least likely to go back on her. "It was simply inhuman of Pragg to go off now," Mrs. Trenor declared as her friend seated herself at the desk. "She says her sister is going to have a baby, as if that were anything to having a house party. I'm sure I shall get most horribly mixed up, and there will be some awful rows. When I was down at Tuxedo, I asked a lot of people for next week, and I have mislaid the list, and I can't remember who's coming. And this week is going to be a horrid failure, too. And Gwen Van Osburgh will go back and tell her mother how bored people were. I didn't mean to ask the Wetheralls. That was a blunder of Gus's. They disapprove of Carrie Fisher, you know, as if one could help having Carrie Fisher. It was foolish of her to get that second divorce. Carrie always overdoes things, but she said the only way to get a penny out of Fisher was to divorce him and make him pay alimony. And poor Carrie has to consider every dollar. It's really absurd of Alice Wetherall to make such a fuss about meeting her when one thinks of what society is coming to. Someone said the other day that there was a divorce and a case of appendicitis in every family one knows. Besides, Carrie is the one person who can keep Gus in a good humor when one has bores about the house. Have you ever noticed that all the husbands like her? All, I mean, except her own. It's rather clever of her to have made a specialty of devoting herself to dull people. The field is such a large one, and she has it practically to herself. She finds compensations, no doubt. I know she borrows money of Gus, but then I'd pay her to keep him in good humor, so I can't complain after all. Mrs. Trenor paused to enjoy the spectacle of Miss Bart's efforts to unravel her tangled correspondence. But it isn't only the Wetheralls and Carrie, she resumed, with a fresh note of lament. The truth is, I'm awfully disappointed in Lady Cressida Raith. Disappointed? Hadn't you known her before? Mercy, no. Never saw her till yesterday. Lady Skiddaw sent her over with letters to the Van Osburghs, and I heard that Maria Van Osburgh was asking a big party to meet her this week, so I thought it would be fun to get her away, and Jack Stepney, who knew her in India, managed it for me. Maria was furious, and actually had the impudence to make Gwen invite herself here, so that they shouldn't be quite out of it. If I'd known what Lady Cressida was like, they could all have had her and welcome. But I thought any friend of the Skiddaws was sure to be amusing. You remember what fun Lady Skiddaw was? There were times when I simply had to send the girls out of the room. Besides, Lady Cressida is a Duchess of Beltshire's sister, and I naturally supposed that she was the same sort. But you can never tell in those English families. They are so big that there's room for all kinds. And it turns out that Lady Cressida is the moral one, married a clergyman and does missionary work in the East End. Think of my taking such a lot of trouble about a clergyman's wife who wears Indian jewelry and botanizes. She makes Gus take her all through the glass houses yesterday and bothered him to death by asking him the names of the plants. Fancy treating Gus as though he were the gardener. Mrs. Trenor brought this out in a crescendo of indignation. Oh well, perhaps Lady Cressida will reconcile the Wetheralls to meeting Carrie Fisher, said Miss Bart pacifically. I'm sure I hope so, but she is boring all the men horribly. And if she takes to distributing tracts, as I hear she does, it will be too depressing. The worst of it is, she would have been so useful at the right time. You know, we have to have the bishop once a year, and she would have given just the right tone to things. I always have horrid luck about the bishop's visits, added Mrs. Trenor, whose present misery was being fed by rapidly rising tide of reminiscence. Last year, when he came, Gus forgot all about his being here, and brought home the Ned Wintons and the Farleys, 5 divorces and 6 sets of children between them. When is Lady Cressida going? Lily inquired. Mrs. Trenor cast up her eyes in despair. My dear, if one only knew. I was in such a hurry to get her away from Maria that I actually forgot to name a date. And Gus says that she told someone she meant to stop here for all winter. To stop? Here? In the house? Don't be silly. In America. But if no one else asks her, they never go to hotels. Perhaps Gus only said that to frighten you. No, I heard her tell Bertha Dorset that she had 6 months to put in while her husband was taking the cure in the Engadine. You should have seen Bertha look vacant, but it's no joke, If she stays here all the autumn, she'll spoil everything, and Maria Van Osburgh will simply exult. At this affecting vision, Mrs. Trenor's voice trembled with self-pity. Oh, Judy, as if anybody were ever bored at Bellamont, Miss Bart tactfully protested. You know perfectly well that if Mrs. Van Osburgh were to get all the right people and leave you with all the wrong ones, you'd manage to make things go off. And she wouldn't. Such assurances would certainly have restored Mrs. Trenor's complacency, but on this occasion it did not chase the cloud from her brow. It isn't only Lady Cressida, she lamented. Everything has gone wrong this week. I can see that Bertha Dorset is furious with me. Furious with you? Why? Because I told her that Lawrence Seldon was coming, but he wouldn't after all, and she's quite unreasonable enough to think that it's my fault. Miss Bart put down her pen and sat absently gazing at the note she had begun. I thought that was all over, she said. I So it is, and on his side. And of course Bertha hasn't been idle since, but I fancy she's out of a job just at present. And someone gave me a hint that I better ask Lawrence. Well, I did ask him, but I couldn't make him come, and now I suppose she'll take it out of me by being perfectly nasty to everyone else. Oh, she may take it out of him by being perfectly charming to someone else. Mrs. Trenor shook her head dolefully. She knows he wouldn't mind. And who else is there? Alice Wetherall won't let Lucius out of her sight. Ned Silverton can't take his eyes off Carrie Fisher, poor boy. Gus is bored by Bertha. Jack Stepney knows her too well, and, well, to be sure, there's Percy Gryce. She sat up, smiling at the thought. Miss Bart's countenance did not reflect the smile. Oh, she and Mr. Gryce would not be likely to hit it off. You mean that she'd shock him and he'd bore her? Well, that's not such a bad beginning, but I hope she won't take it into her head to be nice to him. For I asked him here on purpose for you. Lily laughed. Merci du compliment. I should certainly have no show against Bertha. Do you know that I am uncomplimentary? Do you think I am uncomplimentary? I'm not really. Everyone knows that you're 1,000 times handsomer and cleverer than Bertha. But then you're not nasty. As for always getting what she wants in the long run, commend me to a nasty woman. Miss Bart sat in affected reproval. I thought you were so fond of Bertha. Oh, I am. It's much safer to be fond of dangerous people, but she is dangerous. And if I ever saw her up to mischief, it's now. I can tell by poor George's manner. The man is a perfect barometer. He always knows when Bertha is going to fall. Miss Bart suggested. Don't be shocking. You know he believes in her still, but of course I don't say there isn't any real harm in Bertha. She only delights in making people miserable, especially poor George. Well, he seems cut out for that part. I don't wonder she likes more cheerful companionship. Oh, George is not as dismal as you think. If Bertha didn't worry him, he would be quite different. Or if she'd leave him alone and let him arrange his life as he pleases. But she doesn't dare lose her hold of him on account of the money, and so when he isn't jealous, she pretends to be. Miss Bart went on writing in silence, and her hostess sat following her train of thought with a frowning intensity. Do you know, she exclaimed after a long pause, I believe I'll call up Lawrence on the telephone and tell him he simply must come. Oh, don't, said Lily, with a quick suffusion of color. The blush surprised her almost as much as it did her hostess, who, though not commonly observant of facial changes, sat staring at her with puzzled eyes. Good gracious, Lily, how handsome you are! Why, do you dislike him so much? Not at all, I like him. But if you are actuated by the benevolent intention of protecting me from Bertha, I don't think I need your protection. Mrs. Trenor sat up with the exclamation, Lily! Percy! Do you mean to say that you've actually done it? Miss Bart smiled. I only mean to say that Mr. Gryce and I are getting to be good friends. I see. Mrs. Trenor fixed a rapt eye upon her. You know, they say he has 800,000 a year and spends nothing except on some rubbishy old books, and his mother has heart disease and will leave him a lot more. Oh, Lily, do go slowly, her friend adjured her. Miss Bart continued to smile without annoyance. I shouldn't, for instance, she remarked, be in any haste to tell him that he had a lot of rubbishy old books. No, of course not. I know you're wonderful about getting at people's subjects, but he's terribly shy and easily shocked and why don't you just say it, Judy? I have the reputation of being on the hunt for a rich husband. Oh, I didn't mean that. He wouldn't believe it of you at first, said Mrs. Trenor with candid shrewdness. But you know, things are rather lively here at times. I must give Jack and Gus a hint. And if he thought that you were what his mother would call fast, oh, well, you know what I mean. Don't wear your scarlet crêpe de chine for dinner, and don't smoke if you can help it, Lily dear." Lily pushed aside her finished work with a dry smile. "You're very kind, Judy. I'll lock up my cigarettes and wear that last year's dress you sent me this morning. And if you really are interested in my career, perhaps you'll be kind enough not to ask me to play bridge again this evening." "Bridge? Does he mind bridge too? Oh, Lily, what an awful life you'll lead. But of course I won't. Why didn't you give me that hint last night? There's nothing I wouldn't do, you poor duck, to see you happy." And Mrs. Trenor, glowing with her sex's eagerness to smooth the course of true love, enveloped Lily in a long embrace. "You're quite sure," she added solicitously as the latter extricated herself, "that you wouldn't like me to telephone for Lawrence Seldon?" "Quite sure," said Lily. The next 3 days demonstrated to her own complete satisfaction Miss Bart's ability to manage her affairs without extraneous aid. As she sat on that Saturday afternoon on the terrace at Bellamont, she smiled at Mrs. Trenor's fear that she might go too fast. If such a warning had ever been needed, the years had taught her a salutary lesson, and she flattered herself that she now knew how to adapt her pace to the object of pursuit. In the case of Mr. Gryce, she had found it well to flutter ahead, losing herself elusively and luring him on from depth to depth of unconscious intimacy. The surrounding atmosphere was propitious to this scheme of courtship. Mrs. Trenor, true to her word, had showed no signs of expecting Lily at the bridge table, and had even hinted to the other card players that they were to betray no surprise of her unwonted defection. In consequence of this hint, Lily found herself at the center of that feminine solicitude which envelops a young woman in the mating season. A solicitude was tacitly created for her in the crowded existence of Bellamont, and her friends could not have shown a greater readiness for self-effacement had her wooing been adorned with all the attributes of romance. In Lily's set, this conduct implied a sympathetic comprehension of her motives, and Mr. Gryce rose in her esteem as she saw the consideration he inspired. The terrace at Bellamont on a September afternoon was a spot propitious to sentimental musings, and as Miss Bart stood leaning against the balustrade above the sunken garden at a little distance from the animated group about the tea-table, she might have been lost in the mazes of an inarticulate happiness. In reality, her thoughts were finding definite utterance in the tranquil recapitulation of the blessings in store for her. From where she stood, she could see them embodied in the form of Mr. Gryce, who in the light overcoat and muffler sat somewhat nervously on the edge of his chair, while Carrie Fisher, with all the energy of eye and gesture with which nature and art had combined to endow her, pressed on him the duty of retaking part in the task of municipal reform. Mrs. Fisher's latest hobby was municipal reform. It had been preceded by an equal zeal for socialism, which had in turn replaced an energetic advocacy of Christian Science. Mrs. Fisher was a small, fiery, and dramatic, and her hands and eyes were admirable instruments in the service of whatever cause she happened to espouse. She had, however, the fault, common to enthusiasts, of ignoring any slackness of response on the part of her hearers, and Lily was amused by her unconsciousness of the resistance displayed in every angle of Mr. Gryce's attitude. Lily herself knew that his mind was divided between the dread of catching cold, if he remained out of doors for too long in that hour, and the fear that if he retreated to the house, Mrs. Fisher might follow him with a paper to be signed. Mr. Gryce had a constitutional dislike to what he called committing himself, and tenderly as he cherished his health, he evidently concluded that it was safer to stay out of reach of pen and ink till chance released him from Mrs. Fisher's toils. Meanwhile, he cast agonized glances in the direction of Miss Bart, whose only response was to sink into an attitude of more graceful abstraction. She had learned the value of contrast in throwing her arms into relief, and was fully aware of the extent to which Mrs. Fisher's volubility was enhancing her own repose. She was roused from her musings by the approach of her cousin Jack Stepney, who, at Gwen Van Osburgh's side, was returning across the garden from the tennis court. The couple in question were engaged in some kind of a romance in which Lily figured, and the latter felt a certain annoyance in contemplating what seemed to her a caricature of her own situation. Miss Van Osburgh was a large girl with flat surfaces and no highlights. Jack Stepney had once said of her that she was as reliable as a roast mutton. His own taste was in the line of less solid and more highly seasoned diet, but hunger made any fare palatable, and there had been times when Mr. Stepney had been reduced to a crust. Lily considered with interest the expression of their faces. The girls turned toward her companions like an empty plate held up to be filled, while the man lounging at her side already betrayed the encroaching boredom which would presently crack the thin veneer of his smile. How impatient men are, Lily reflected. All Jack has to do is get everything he wants is to keep quiet and let that girl marry him, whereas I have to calculate and contrive and retreat and advance as if I were going through an intricate dance where one misstep would throw me hopelessly out of time. As they drew nearer, she was whimsically struck by the kind of family likeness between Miss Van Osburgh and Percy Gryce. There was no resemblance of feature. Gryce was handsome in a didactic way. He looked like a clever pupil's drawing from a plaster cast, while Gwen's countenance had no more modelling than the face painted on a toy balloon. But the deeper affinity was unmistakable. The two had the same prejudices and ideals, and the same quality of making other standards non-existent by ignoring them. This attribute was common to most of Lily's set. They had a force of negation which eliminated everything beyond their own range of perception. Gryce and Miss Van Osburgh were, in short, made for each other by every law of moral and physical correspondence, yet they wouldn't look at each other, Lily mused. They never do. Each of them wants a creature of a different race, of Jack's race and mine, with all sorts of intuitions, sensations, and perceptions that they don't even guess the existence of, and they always get what they want. She stood talking with her cousin and Miss Van Osburgh till a slight cloud on the latter's brow advised her that even cousinly amenities were subject to suspicion, and Miss Bart, mindful of the necessity of not exciting enmities at this crucial point of her career, dropped aside while the happy couple proceeded toward the tea-table. Seating herself on the upper step of the terrace, Lily leaned her head against the honeysuckles wreathing the balustrade. The fragrance of the late blossoms seemed an emanation of the tranquil scene, a landscape tutored to the last degree of rural elegance. In the foreground glowed the warm tints of the gardens. Beyond the lawn, with its pyramidal pale gold maples and velvety firs, sloped pastures dotted with cattle, and through a long glade the river widened like a lake under the silver light of September. Lily did not want to join the circle about the tea-table. They represented the future she had chosen, and she was content with it, but in no haste to anticipate its joys. The certainty that she could marry Percy Gryce when she pleased had lifted a heavy load from her mind, and her money troubles were too recent for their removal not to leave a sense of relief, which a less discerning intelligence might have taken for happiness. Her vulgar cares were at an end. She would be able to arrange her life as she pleased, to soar into that empyrean of security where creditors cannot penetrate. She would have smarter gowns than Judy Trenor, and far, far more jewels than Bertha Dorset. She would be free forever from the shifts, the expedients, the humiliations of the relatively poor. Instead of having to flatter, she would be flattered. Instead of being grateful, she would receive thanks. There were old scores she could pay off as well as old benefits she could return, and she had no doubts as to the extent of her power. She knew that Mr. Gryce was of the small Chari type, most inaccessible to impulses and emotions. He had the kind of character in which prudence is a vice and good advice the most dangerous nourishment. But Lily had known the species before. She was aware that such a guarded nature must find one huge outlet for egoism, and she determined to be to him what his Americana had hitherto been, the one possession in which he took sufficient pride to spend money on it. She knew that this generosity to self is one of the forms of meanness, and she resolved so to identify herself with her husband's vanity that to gratify her wishes would be to him the most exquisite form of self indulgence. The system might at first necessitate a resort to some of the very shifts and expedients from which she intended it should free her, but she felt sure that in a short time she would be able to play the game in her own way. How should she have distrusted her powers? Her beauty itself was not the mere ephemeral possession it might have been in the hands of inexperience. Her skill in enhancing it, the care she took of it, the use she made of it, seemed to give it a kind of permanence. She felt she could trust it to carry her through to the end. At the end, and the end, on the whole, was worthwhile. Life was not the mockery she had thought it 3 days ago. There was room for her, after all, in this crowded, selfish world of pleasure whence, so short a time since, her poverty had seemed to exclude her. These people whom she had ridiculed and yet envied were glad to make a place for her in the charmed circle about which all of her desires revolved. They were not as brutal and self-engrossed as she had fancied, or rather, since it would no longer be necessary to flatter and humor them, that side of their nature became less conspicuous. Society is a revolving body, which is apt to be judged according to its place in each man's heaven, and at present it was turning its illuminated face to Lily. In the rosy glow it diffused, her companions seemed full of amiable qualities. She liked their elegance, their lightness, their lack of emphasis, even the self-assurance which, at times, was so like obtuseness, now seemed a natural sign of social ascendancy. They were lords of the only world she cared for, and they were ready to admit her to their ranks and let her lord it with them. Already she felt within her a stealing allegiance to their standards, an acceptance of their limitations, a disbelief in the things they did not believe in, a contemptuous pity for the people who were not able to live as they lived. The early sunset was slanting across the park. Through the boughs of the very long avenue beyond the gardens, she caught the flash of wheels and divined that more visitors were approaching. There was a movement behind her, a scattering of steps and voices. It was evident that the party about the tea table was breaking up. Presently she heard a tread behind her on the terrace. She supposed that Mr. Gryce had at last found means to escape from his predicament, and she smiled at the significance of his coming to join her instead of beating an instant retreat to the fireside. She turned to give him the welcome which such gallantry deserved. But her greeting wavered into a blush of wonder, for the man who had approached her was Lawrence Seldon. "You see, I came after all," he said, but before she had time to answer, Mrs. Dorset, breaking away from a lifeless colloquy with her host, had stepped between them with a little gesture of appropriation. Chapter 5. The observance of Sunday at Belmont was chiefly marked by the punctual appearance of the smart omnibus destined to convey the household to the little church at the gates. Whether anyone got into the omnibus or not was a matter of secondary importance, since by standing there, it not only bore witness to the orthodox intentions of the family, but made Mrs. Trenor feel, when she finally heard it drive away, that she had somehow vicariously made use of it. It was Mrs. Trenor's theory that her daughters actually did go to church every Sunday, but their French governess's conviction calling her to the rival fane and the fatigues of the week keeping their mother in her room till luncheon, there was seldom anyone present to verify the fact. Now and then, in a spasmodic burst of virtue, when the house had been too uproarious overnight, Gus Trenor forced his genial bulk into the tight frock coat and routed his daughters from their slumbers, but habitually, as Lily explained to Mr. Gryce, this parental duty was forgotten till the church bells were ringing across the park and the omnibus had driven away empty. Lily had hinted to Mr. Gryce that this neglect of religious observances was repugnant to her early traditions, and that during her visits to Bellamont she regularly accompanied Muriel and Hilda to church. This tallied with the assurance also confidentially imparted that never having played bridge before, she had been dragged into it on the night of her arrival, and had lost an appalling amount of money in consequence of her ignorance of the game and the rules of betting. Mr. Gryce was undoubtedly enjoying Bellamont. He liked the ease and glitter of the life, and the luster conferred on him by being a member of this group of rich and conspicuous people. But he thought it very materialistic society. There were times when he was frightened by the talk of the men and the looks of the ladies, and he was glad to find that Miss Bart, for all her ease and self-possession, was not at home in so ambiguous an atmosphere. For this reason, he had been especially pleased to learn that she would, as usual, attend the young Trenors to church on Sunday morning, and as he paced the gravel sweep before the door, his light overcoat on his arm and his prayer book in one carefully gloved hand, he reflected agreeably on the strength of character which kept her true to her early training in surroundings so subversive to religious principles. For a long time, Mr. Gryce and the omnibus had the gravel sweep to themselves, but far from regretting this deplorable indifference on the part of the other guests, he found himself nourishing hope that Miss Bart might be unaccompanied. The precious minutes were flying, however. The big chestnuts pawed the ground and flecked their impatient sides with foam. The coachman seemed to be slowly petrifying on the spot, and the groom on the doorstep, and still the lady did not come. Suddenly, however, there was the sound of voices and a rustle of skirts in the doorway, and Mr. Gryce, restoring his watch to his pocket, turned with a nervous start, but it was only to find himself handing Mrs. Wetherall into the carriage. The Wetheralls always went to church. They belong to the vast group of human automata who go through life without neglecting to perform a single one of the gestures executed by the surrounding puppets. It is true that the Bellamont puppets did not go to church, but others equally important did, and Mr. and Mrs. Wetherall's circle was so large that God was included in their visiting list. They appeared, therefore, punctual and resigned, with an air of people bound for a dull at-home, and after them Hilda and Muriel straggled, yawning, and pinning each other's veils and ribbons as they came. They had promised Lily to go to the church with her, they declared, and Lily was such a dear old duck that they didn't mind doing it to please her, though they couldn't fancy what had put the idea in her head, and though for their own part they would much rather have played lawn tennis with Jack and Gwen if she hadn't told them that she was coming. The Mrs. Trenors were followed by Lady Cressida Raith, a weather-beaten person in Liberty silk and ethnological trinkets, who, on seeing the omnibus, expressed her surprise that they were not to walk across the park. But at Mrs. Wetherall's horrified protest that the church was a mile away, her ladyship, after a glance at the height of the other's heels, acquiesced in the necessity of driving, and poor Mr. Gryce found himself rolling off between four ladies for whose spiritual welfare he had not the least concern. It might have afforded him some consolation could he have known that Miss Bart had really meant to go to church. She had even risen earlier than usual in the execution of her purpose. She had no idea that the sight of her in a grey gown of devotional cut, with her famous lashes drooped above a prayer book, would have put the finishing touch to Mr. Gryce's subjugation, and render inevitable a certain incident which she had resolved should form a part of the walk they were to take together after luncheon. Her intentions, in short, had never been more definite. But poor Lily! For all the hard glace of her exterior was inwardly as malleable as wax. Her faculty for adapting herself, for entering into other people's feelings, if it served her now and then, in small contingencies, hampered her in the decisive moments of life. She was like a water plant in the flux of the tides, and today the whole current of her mood was carrying her toward Lawrence Seldon. Why had he come? Was it to see herself or Bertha Dorset? It was the last question which at that moment should have engaged her. She might better have contented herself with thinking that he had simply responded to the despairing summons of his hostess, anxious to interpose him between herself and the ill humor of Mrs. Dorset. But Lily had not rested till she learned from Mrs. Trenor that Selden had come of his own accord. He didn't even wire me. He just happened to find the trap at the station. Perhaps it's not over with Bertha after all, Mrs. Trenor musingly concluded, and went away to arrange her dinner cards accordingly. Perhaps it was not, Lily reflected, but it should be soon, unless she had lost her cunning. If Selden had come at Mrs. Dorset's call, it was at her own that he would stay. So much the previous evening had told her. Mrs. Trenor, true to her simple principle of making her married friends happy, had placed Selden and Mrs. Dorset next to one another at dinner. But in obedience to the time-honored traditions of the matchmaker, she had separated Lily and Mr. Gryce, sending the former with George Dorset, while Mr. Gryce was coupled with Gwen Van Osburgh. George Dorset's talk did not interfere with the range of his neighbor's thoughts. He was a mournful dyspeptic, intent on finding out the deleterious ingredients of every dish, and diverted from this care only to the sound of his wife's voice. On this occasion, however, Mrs. Dorset took no part in the general conversation. She sat talking in low murmurs with Selden, and turning a contemptuous and denuded shoulder toward her host, who, far from resenting his exclusion, plunged into the excesses of the menu with the joyous irresponsibility of a free man. To Mr. Dorset, however, his wife's attitude was a subject of such evident concern that when he was not scraping the sauce from his fish or scooping the moist bread crumbs from the interior of his roll, he sat straining his thin neck for a glimpse of her between the lights. Mrs. Trenor, as it chanced, had placed the husband and wife on opposite sides of the table, and Lily was therefore able to observe Mrs. Dorset also, and by carrying her glance a few feet further, to set up a rapid comparison between Lawrence Seldon and Mr. Gryce. It was that comparison which was her undoing. Why else had she suddenly grown interested in Seldon? She had known him for 8 years or more, ever since her return to America. He had formed a part of her background. She had always been glad to sit next to him at dinner, and found him more agreeable than most men, and had vaguely wished that he possessed all the other qualities needful to fix her attention. But till now she had been too busy with her own affairs to regard him as more than one of the pleasant accessories of life. Miss Bart was a keen reader of her own heart, and she saw that her sudden preoccupation with Selden was due to a fact that his presence shed a new light on her surroundings. Not that he was notably brilliant or exceptional. In his own profession, he was surpassed by more than one man who had bored Lily through many a weary dinner. It was rather that he had preserved a certain social detachment, a happy air of viewing the show objectively, of having points of contact outside the great gilt cage in which they were all huddled for a mob to gape at. How alluring the world outside the cage appeared to Lily, as she heard its door clang on her. In reality, as she knew, the door never clanged, it stood always open. But most of the captives were like flies in a bottle, and having once flown in, could never regain their freedom. It was Selden's distinction that he had never forgotten the way out. That was the secret of his way of readjusting her vision. Lily, turning her eyes from him, found herself scanning her little world through his retina. It was as though the pink lamps had been shut off and the dusty daylight let in. She looked down the long table, studying its occupants one by one. From Gus Trenor, with his heavy carnivorous head sunk between his shoulders as he preyed on a jellied plover, to his wife at the opposite end of the long bank of orchids, suggestive, with her glaring good looks, of a jeweller's window lit by electricity. And between the two, what a long stretch of vacuity! How dreary and trivial these people were! Lily reviewed them with a scornful impatience. Carrie Fisher, with her shoulders, her eyes, her divorces, her general air of embodying a spicy paragraph. Young Silverton, who had meant to live on proofreading and write an epic, and who now lived on his friends and had become critical of truffles. Alice Wetherall, an animated visiting list, whose most fervid convictions turned on the wording of invitations and the engraving of dinner cards. Wetherall, with his perpetual nervous nod of acquiescence, his air of agreeing with people before he knew what they were saying. Jack Stepney, with his confident smile and anxious eyes, halfway between the sheriff and an heiress. Gwen Van Osburgh, with all the guileless confidence of a young girl who has always been told that there is no one richer than her father. Lily smiled at her classification of her friends. How different they had seemed to her a few hours ago. Then they had symbolized what she was gaining. Now they stood for what she was giving up. That very afternoon they had seemed full of brilliant qualities. Now she saw that they were merely dull in a loud way. Under the glitter of their opportunities, she saw the poverty of their achievement. It was not that she wanted them to be more disinterested, but she would have liked them to be more picturesque. And she had a shamed recollection of the way in which a few hours since she had felt the centripetal force of their standards. She closed her eyes an instant, and the vacuous routine of the life she had chosen stretched before her like a long white road without dip or turning. It was true, she was to roll over it in a carriage instead of trudging it on foot. But sometimes the pedestrian enjoys the diversion of a shortcut which is denied to those on wheels. She was roused by the chuckle which Mr. Dorset seemed to eject from the depths of his lean throat. "I say, do look at her," he exclaimed, turning to Miss Bart with a lugubrious merriment. "I beg your pardon, but do just look at my wife, making a fool of that poor devil over there. One would really suppose she was gone on him, and it's the other way round, I assure you." Thus adjured, Lily turned her eyes to the spectacle which was affording Mr. Dorset such legitimate mirth. It certainly appeared, as he said, that Mrs. Dorset was the most active participant in the scene. Her neighbour seemed to receive her advances with a temperate zest which did not distract him from his dinner. The sight restored Lily's good humour, and knowing the particular disguise which Mr. Dorset's marital fears assumed, she asked gaily, "Aren't you horribly jealous of her?" Dorset greeted the sally with delight. "Oh, abominably! You've just hit at it. Keeps me awake at night. The doctors tell me that's what has knocked my digestion out. Being so infernally jealous of her, I can't eat a mouthful of this stuff, you know," he added suddenly, pushing back his plate with a clouded countenance, and Lily, unfailingly adaptable, accorded her radiant attention to his prolonged denunciation of other people's cooks, with a supplementary tirade on the toxic qualities of melted butter. It was not often that he found so ready an ear, and, being a man as well as a dyspeptic, it may be that as he poured his grievances into it, he was not insensible to its rosy symmetry. At any rate, he engaged Lily so long as the sweets were being handed when she caught a phrase on her other side, where Miss Corby, the comic woman of the company, was bantering Jack Stepney on his approaching engagement. Miss Corby's role was jocularity. She always entered the conversation with a handspring. "And of course you'll have Sim Rosedale as best man," Lily heard her fling out as a climax of her prognostications, and Stepney replied, as if struck. Jove, that's an idea. What a thumping present I'd get out of him. Sim Rosedale, the name made more odious by its diminutive, obtruded itself on Lily's thoughts like a leer. It stood for one of the many hated possibilities hovering on the edge of life. If she did not marry Percy Gryce, the day might come when she would have to be civil to such men as Rosedale. If she did not marry him, but she meant to marry him. She was sure of him. She was sure of herself. She drew back with a shiver from the pleasant paths in which her thoughts had been straying, and set her feet once more on the middle of the long white road. When she went upstairs that night, she found that the late post had brought her a fresh batch of bills. Mrs. Peniston, who was a conscientious woman, had forwarded them all to Bellamont. Miss Bart accordingly rose the next morning with the most earnest conviction that it was her duty to go to church. She tore herself betimes from the lingering enjoyment of her breakfast tray, rang to have her grey gown laid out, and dispatched her maid to borrow a prayer book from Mrs. Trenor. But of course it too purely reasonable not to contain the germs of rebellion. No sooner were her preparations made than they roused a smothered sense of resistance. The small spark was enough to kindle Lily's imagination, and the sight of the grey dress and the borrowed prayer book flashed a long light down the years. She would have to go to church with Percy Gryce every Sunday. They would have a front pew in the most expensive church in New York, and his name would figure handsomely in the list of parish charities. In a few years, when he grew stouter, he would be made a warden. Once in the winter, the rector would come to dine, and her husband would beg her to go over the list and see that no divorcees were included, except those who had showed signs of penitence by being remarried to the very wealthy. There was nothing especially arduous in this round of religious obligations, but it stood for a fraction of that great bulk of boredom which loomed across her path. And who could consent to be bored on such a morning? Lily had slept well, and her bath had filled her with a pleasant glow, which was becomingly reflected in the clear curve of her cheek. No lines were visible this morning, or else the glass was at a happier angle. And the day was the accomplice of her mood, and it was a joy for impulse and truancy. The light air seemed full of powdered gold below the dewy bloom of the lawns in the woodlands, blushed and smoldered, and the hills across the river swam in molten blue. Every drop of blood in Lily's veins invited her to happiness. The sound of the wheels roused her from these musings, and, leaning behind her shutters, she saw the omnibus taking up its freight. She was too late, then, but the fact did not alarm her. A glimpse of Mr. Gryce's crestfallen face even suggested that she had done wisely in absenting herself, since the disappointment he so candidly betrayed would surely be whet his appetite for the afternoon walk. That walk she did not mean to miss. One glance at the bills on her writing table was enough to recall its necessity. But meanwhile she had the morning to herself, and she could muse pleasantly on the disposal of its hours. She was familiar enough with the habits of Bellamont to know that she was likely to have a free field till luncheon. She had seen the Wetheralls and the Trenor girls and Lady Cressida pack themselves safely into the omnibus. Judy Trenor was sure to be having her hair shampooed. Carrie Fisher had doubtless carried off her host for a drive. Ned Silverton was probably smoking the cigarette of a young despair in his bedroom, and Kate Corby was certain to be playing tennis with Jack Stepney and Miss Van Osburgh. Of the ladies, this only left Mrs. Dorset unaccounted for, and Mrs. Dorset never came down till luncheon. Her doctors, she averred, had forbidden her to expose herself to the crude air of the morning. To the remaining members of the party, Lily gave no special thought. Wherever they were not likely to interfere with her plans. These, for the moment, took the shape of assuming a dress somewhat more rustic and summer-like in style than the garment that she had first selected, and rustling downstairs, sunshade in hand, with the disengaged air of a lady in quest of exercise. The great hall was empty, but for the knot of dogs by the fireplace who, taking in at a glance the outdoor aspect of Miss Bart, were upon her at once with lavish offers of companionship. She put aside the ramping paws which conveyed these offers, and assuring the joyous volunteers that she might presently have a use for their company, sauntered on through the empty drawing room to the library at the end of the house. The library was almost the only surviving portion of the old manor house of Bellamont, a long, spacious room, revealing the traditions of the mother country in its classically cased doors, the Dutch tiles of the chimney, and the elaborate hop-gate with its shining brass urns. A few family portraits of lantern-jawed gentlemen in tie-wigs and ladies with large head-dresses and small bodies hung between the shelves lined with pleasantly shabby books mostly contemporaneous with the ancestors in question, and to which the subsequent Trenors had made no perceptible additions. The library at Bellamont was in fact never used for reading, though it had a certain popularity as a smoking room or a quiet retreat for flirtation. It had occurred to Lily, however, that it might on this occasion have been resorted to by the only member of the party in the least likely to put it to its original use. She advanced noiselessly over the dense old rug, scattered with easy chairs, and before she reached the middle of the room she saw that she had not been mistaken. Lawrence Seldon was in fact seated in its farther end. But though a book lay on his knee, his attention was not engaged with it, but directed to a lady whose lace-clad figure, as she leaned back in an adjoining chair, detached itself with exaggerated slimness against the dusky leather of the upholstery. Lily paused as she caught a sight of her group. For a moment she seemed about to withdraw, but thinking better of this, she announced her approach by a slight shake of her skirts, which made the couple raise their heads. Mrs. Dorset with a look of frank displeasure, and Selden with his usual quiet smile. The sight of his composure had a disturbing effect on Lily, but to be disturbed was in her case to make a more brilliant effort at self-possession. "Dear me, am I late?" she asked, putting her hand in his as he advanced to greet her. "Late for what?" inquired Mrs. Dorset tartly. "Not for luncheon, certainly, but perhaps you had an earlier engagement?" "Yes, I had," said Lily confidently. "Really? Perhaps I am in the way then, but Mr. Selden is entirely at your disposal." Mrs. Dorset was pale with temper, and her antagonist felt a certain pleasure in prolonging her distress. "Oh dear, no, do stay," she said good-humoredly. "I don't in the least want to drive you away." "You're awfully good, dear, but I never interfere with Mr. Selden's engagements." The remark was uttered with a little air of proprietorship not lost on its object, who concealed a faint blush of annoyance by stooping to pick up a book he had dropped at Lily's approach. The latter's eyes widened charmingly, and she broke into a light laugh. "But I have no engagement with Mr. Selden. My engagement was to go to church, and I'm afraid the omnibus has started without me. Has it started? Do you know?" She turned to Selden, who replied that he had heard it drive away some time since. "Ah, then I shall have to walk. I promised Hilda and Muriel to go to church with them. It's too late to walk there, you say? Well, I shall have the credit of trying at any rate, and the advantage of escaping part of the service. I'm not so sorry for myself after all." And with a bright nod to the couple on whom she had intruded, Miss Bart strolled through the glass doors and carried her rustling grace down the long perspective of the garden walk. She was taking her way churchward, but not at so very great pace, a fact not lost on one of her observers, who stood in the doorway looking after her with an air of puzzled amusement. The truth is that she was conscious of a somewhat keen shock of disappointment. All her plans for the day had been built on the assumption that it was to see her that Selden had come to Belmont. She had not expected when she came downstairs to find him on the watch for her, and she had found him instead in a situation which might well denote that he had been on the watch for another lady. Was it possible, after all, that he had come for Bertha Dorset? The latter had acted on the assumption to the extent of appearing at an hour when she never showed herself to ordinary mortals, and Lily, for the moment, saw no way of putting her in the wrong. It did not occur to her that Selden might have been actuated merely by the desire to spend a Sunday out of town. Women never learn to dispense with the sentimental motive in their judgments of men, but Lily was not easily disconcerted. Competition put her on her mettle, and she reflected that Selden's coming, if it did not declare him to be still in Mrs. Dorset's toils, showed him to be so completely free from them that he was not afraid of her proximity. These thoughts so engaged her that she fell into a gait hardly likely to carry her to church before the sermon, and at length, having passed from the gardens to the wood path beyond, so far forgot her intention as to sink into a rustic seat at a bend of the walk. The spot was charming, and Lily was not insensible to the charm, or to the fact that her presence enhanced it, but she was not accustomed to taste the joys of solitude except in company, and the combination of a handsome girl and a romantic scene struck her as too good to be wasted. No one, however, appeared to profit by the opportunity, and after a half hour of fruitless waiting, she rose and wandered on. She felt a stealing sense of fatigue as she walked. The sparkle had died out of her, and the taste of life was stale on her lips. She hardly knew what had been seeking, or why the failure to find it had so blotted the light from her sky. She was only aware of a vague sense of failure, of an inner isolation deeper than the loneliness about her. Her footsteps flagged, and she stood gazing listlessly ahead, digging the ferny edge of the path with the tip of her sunshade. As she did so, a step sounded behind her, and she saw Selden at her side. "How fast you walk," he remarked. "I thought I should never catch up with you." She answered gaily, "You must be quite breathless. I've been sitting under a tree for an hour." "Waiting for me, I hope," he rejoined, and she said with a vague laugh, "Well, waiting to see if you would come." I seized the distinction, but I don't mind it, since doing the one involved doing the other. But weren't you sure that I should come? If I waited long enough, but you see, I had only a limited time to give to the experiment. Why limited? Limited by luncheon? No, by my other engagement. Your engagement to go to church with Muriel and Hilda? No, but to come home from church with another person. Ah, I see. I might have known that you were fully provided with alternatives. And is the other person coming home this way? Lily laughed again. "That's just what I don't know, and to find out, it is my business to get to church before the service is over." "Exactly, and it is my business to prevent your doing so, in which case the other person, piqued by your absence, will form the desperate resolve of driving back in the omnibus." Lily received this with fresh appreciation. His nonsense was like the bubbling of her inner mood. "Is that what you would do in such an emergency?" she inquired. Selden looked at her with solemnity. "I am here to prove to you," he cried, "what I am capable of doing in an emergency. Walking a mile in an hour, you must own that the omnibus would have been quicker? Ah, but will he find you in the end? That's the only test of success." They looked at each other with the same luxury of enjoyment that they had felt in exchanging absurdities over his tea-table. But suddenly Lily's face changed, and she said, "Well, if it is, he has succeeded." Selden, following her glance, perceived a party of people advancing toward them from the farther bend in the path. Lady Cressida had evidently insisted on walking home, and the rest of the church-goers had thought it their duty to accompany her. Lily's companion looked rapidly from one to the other of the two men of the party, Wetherall walking respectfully at Lady Cressida's side, with his little sidelong look of nervous attention, and Percy Gryce bringing up the rear with Mrs. Wetherall and the Trenors. "Ah, now I see why you were getting up on your Americana," Selden exclaimed with a note of the freest admiration, but the blush which with the sally was received checked whatever amplifications he had meant to give it. That Lily Bart should object to being bantered about her suitors or even about her means of attracting them was so new to Selden that he had a momentary flash of surprise which lit up a number of possibilities, but she rose gallantly to the defense of her confusion by saying, as its object approached, "That's why I was waiting for you, to thank you for having given me so many points." "Ah, you can hardly do justice to the subject in such a short time," said Selden, as the Trenor girls caught sight of Miss Bart, and while she signalled a response to their boisterous greeting, he added quickly, "Won't you devote your afternoon to it? You know, I must be off tomorrow morning. We'll take a walk, and you can thank me at your leisure." End of chapter 5.